In this update and discussion video, there are 3 big stories with updates. New developments on the origins of COVID and the possibility of a leak from the Wuhan Lab, the ongoing saga about Ivermectin, and climate skeptics are kicking back against an important climate fact-checking website. Let's have a look. Lots of people have been talking about the origins of COVID over recent weeks, and there's been some interesting developments. Earlier this month, there was a leak of a proposal that had been submitted to the US security research agency DARPA by Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance. The proposal was for Project Defuse, defusing the threat of bat-borne coronaviruses. Amount requested $14 million, date of request March 2018. It would have seen them intensively sampling bats at various sites where we have identified high spillover risk SARS-CoVs. We will sequence their spike proteins, reverse engineer them to conduct binding assays and insert them into bats' SARS-CoV backbones. These use bat SARS-CoV backbones, not SARS-CoV, and are exempt from dual use and gain of function concerns to infect humanized mice and assess capacity to cause SARS-like disease. The proposal also talked about introducing human-specific cleavage sites, the thing that makes COVID-19 able to infect humans. We will analyse all SARS-CoV gene sequences for appropriately conserved proteolytic cleavage sites in S2 and for the presence of potential furin cleavage sites. Where clear mismatches occur, we will introduce appropriate human-specific cleavage sites and evaluate growth potential in vero cells and HAE cultures. This excited attention, as you can imagine, because it showed that EcoHealth Alliance was actively seeking to run the exact sort of project with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which you would expect could have led to a lab leak. It also implied active attempts to get around the federal ban on funding gain-of-function research by stressing very technical definitional distinctions. Gain-of-function is research that takes a virus and has capabilities to it that it previously didn't have. It also mentions dual use. Dual-use research of concern is something that is designed to have a clear benefit but could be misused to create harm. Still, you'd expect that since it's such a grey area that it needs to argue why it doesn't meet those definitions, it would have a full risk assessment included behind the work proposed. And indeed, there is a section titled Risks to the General Public. Here it is in full. The proposed work has minimal risk to the general public, as sampling will be done near cave sites and not in populous areas. Our team has extensive experience. So that's all right then. In the event, this proposal was not accepted by DARPA. For one thing, DARPA disagreed that the proposed research did not constitute gain-of-function research. In the rejection letter, it said this: the team's approach does potentially involve gain-of-function / dual-use research of concern. They aim to synthesize spike glycoproteins that may bind to human cell receptors and insert them into SARS-CoV backbones to assess capacity to cause SARS-like disease. What relation did this proposal have to work that was subsequently funded by the National Institute of Health, the grant that Anthony Fauci insisted did not constitute gain-of-function research? Shannon Murray, a staff scientist at US Right to Know, reviewed both proposal and the studies conducted via NIH grant and said that they described similar gain-of-function experiments. Some of the same experimental platforms flagged by DARPA as being gain-of-function and dual-use research were those performed in the bat coronavirus emergence grant funded by NIH for 6 years. Now that's an opinion, not a detailed analysis, but even so, some tough questions to be asked about US funding support. Does it prove anything about the origin of COVID? Not specifically. It doesn't prove that COVID was human-manipulated virus, although it's certainly compatible with that idea. As far as the conversation goes, you have some people who say that the nature of SARS-CoV-2's genome demonstrates it was definitely manipulated in a lab, and you have other people arguing that the nature of the SARS-CoV-2 genome proves the exact opposite. As far as I can see, and I don't claim a shred of expertise in the field, the arguments on both sides seem to fall short of definitive proof. Both seem to be influenced to a degree by motivated reasoning, so we need a wise and knowledgeable committee to consider the possibilities. Now, you may recall that there were 2 such committees set up to investigate the origins of COVID-19. There was the World Health Organization one, which sent a group there early this year and included the author of that proposal, Peter Daszak, in spite of the blatant conflict of interest. And there was the one convened by medical journal The Lancet, which was chaired by Peter Daszak, in spite of the blatant conflict of interest. He later recused himself from the second of those, and there's news on both of them. Firstly, the WHO is having another go at a COVID origins inquiry with a fresh team that not only doesn't have Peter Daszak on it, but actually does include some of the expertise it might have been useful to have the first time around. So, for instance, specialists in laboratory safety, biosecurity and genetics. Exactly how all that will work is an open question, since, let's be honest, the chances of China letting in such a constituted group to poke around the Wuhan Institute is surely not great. Not great, of course, being a euphemism for not a snowball's chance in hell. But it's a tacit admission of what a misfire the first operation was, where scientists were shown only what Beijing wanted them to see, and they were told they could only mention the possibility of a lab leak if they did so in order to explicitly discount it. As for the Lancet Commission, Columbia University professor Jeffrey Sachs, who took the task force over from Peter Daszak, decided to shut it down because it was too closely intertwined with Daszak. Several members of the group had collaborated with Daszak or his organisation EcoHealth Alliance. Sachs said this: "I just didn't want a task force that was so clearly involved with one of the main issues of his whole search for the origins, which was EcoHealth Alliance." He said a new Lancet COVID Commission would continue studying the origins for a report to be published in mid-2022, but broaden its scope to include input from other experts on biosafety concerns, including risky laboratory research. The actions of the WHO and Jeffrey Sachs of the Lancet, not to mention, by the way, the President of the United States, suggests that those with access to the best advice don't discount any of the possibilities around the origin of COVID. One new development that does constitute a degree of significant new evidence. A study has been published currently in preprint, so not yet peer-reviewed, saying that a batch of new coronaviruses have been isolated from bats with a receptor-binding domain that is similar to SARS-CoV-2, allowing them to bind to the ACE2 receptors of human cells. In other words, 3 viruses in bats in Laos were more similar to SARS-CoV-2 than any other known viruses. An article in the journal Nature quoted Edward Holmes, who was making this case. When SARS-CoV-2 was first sequenced, the receptor binding domain didn't really look like anything we'd seen before. That caused some people to speculate that the virus had been created in a laboratory, but the Laos coronaviruses confirm these parts of SARS-CoV-2 exist in nature. Singapore virologist Lin Wang said, "I am more convinced than ever that SARS-CoV-2 has a natural origin." Some people have resisted such a conclusion. The article in Nature observed that it's not at all clear how a progenitor of the virus could have travelled from Laos to Wuhan in central China, where the first cases of COVID-19 were identified. And none of those bat viruses carries a furin cleavage site, which is the mechanism that makes SARS-CoV-2 so potently able to infect humans, and the other thing that we hadn't seen in coronaviruses in nature. Lab leak theory proponents had suggested that the Wuhan Institute could have discovered precisely such a virus as this one, and then simply added the furin cleavage site to produce the forerunner of the current virus. Others have treated that idea dismissively, without going into any of the sort of detail that klutzes like me can understand as to why they think it's so out of the question. Of course, nothing requires gain of function to have taken place for it to be possible that the virus was leaked from the lab. We've had evidence that the lab had samples that were not made public, or perhaps that were in the database that the WIV took offline in the middle of the night at the very beginning of the pandemic. So all we know is that we have a few more pieces of the puzzle. Nothing that definitively gives us that final picture. That's where we are on the origin of COVID-19. What about the treatment of COVID-19? The debate still rages about ivermectin. A number of people have been reviewing ivermectin studies to check their integrity in recent months. They have had a letter published in Nature Medicine. It states that given the shambles of the last period, with large numbers of small studies on ivermectin of poor quality, which turn out not to be robust on investigation, there needs to be a better process than the current one. The authors of one recently published meta-analysis of ivermectin for COVID-19 have publicly stated that they will now reanalyze and republish their now retracted meta-analysis and will no longer include either of the two papers just mentioned. As these two papers were the only studies included in that meta-analysis to demonstrate an independently significant reduction in mortality, the revision will probably show no mortality benefit for ivermectin. Several other studies that claim a clinical benefit for ivermectin are similarly fraught and contain impossible numbers in their results. We expect further studies supporting ivermectin to be withdrawn over the coming months. Since those studies were published, they point out, many hundreds of thousands of patients have been dosed with ivermectin, informed by an evidence base that they said had evaporated under close scrutiny. They argue that meta-analyses in the future should carry out analysis on the actual data of the studies being brought together, not just the written up results. Most, if not all, of the flaws described above would have been immediately detected if meta-analyses were performed on an individual patient data (IPD) basis. Fraudulent studies tend to avoid sharing the original data, and if they do, the evidence of fraud is often all too obvious. One of the authors, Gideon Meyerowitz-Katz, tweeted this: I think there are a few things about the ivermectin literature that people don't really get. 1. The scale of the fraud. There are so many dodgy studies. 2. The scale of the good research. Not every study is fraud. A bunch of bad apples really have messed up our understanding to a devastating extent. 3. The thrust of the fraud. Perhaps not unexpectedly, we've yet to find a fabricated/worthless trial that found no benefit. 4. The state of the literature as a whole. I'm getting a bit cynical, as I'm sure anyone would after seeing so much fakery, but it's important to remember we haven't excluded modest benefits from ivermectin yet. Somebody asked the question, why would so many scientists be involved in fraud? Bearing in mind, there are over 9 million physicians, pharmacologists and others doing research, it does still nevertheless remain a tiny percentage. Meyerowitz-Katz pointed to this study and said, I believe the response when asked in surveys is that around 1 to 3% of all researchers admit to committing some kind of data fakery. Although when you ask people about colleagues' behaviour, they reply that the risk is far higher. Meyerowitz-Katz also pointed to a clinical study on ivermectin that has just passed his quality testing with flying colours. I have received the data from this trial from Dr. Guerra, who is delightful, and I have no concerns that the data is manipulated or fraudulent. One thing this really clarified was how easy this all is for non-fraudulent trials. I received a reply to my second email and had an anonymised data within an hour. Basic fraud checks completed a few hours later. Very simple stuff. Also, this is not a comment on whether ivermectin works or not. All I am saying is that this trial definitely isn't fraudulent. Turns out that's relatively uncommon in the ivermectin literature. The paper he's talking about was this one. That final caveat comes because the paper's conclusion was this: in non-critical hospitalised patients with COVID-19 pneumonia, neither ivermectin nor hydroxychloroquine decreases the number of in-hospital days, respiratory deterioration or deaths. Now, it was a small study. The fact that it was well run doesn't make it the last word on anything. We still await the large-scale clinical study from Oxford. In the meantime, people continue to attempt to self-medicate with it in inadvisable ways. The State Health Department at New Mexico reported that it has now linked 2 deaths to the misuse of ivermectin. The 2 patients, one aged 38, one aged 79, were amongst 14, it says, have been hospitalised for ivermectin poisoning. Now, it doesn't go into details, but since moderate doses are prescribed to people for a number of treatments and it's rated as generally very safe, you have to assume that this was horse level, at least veterinary doses. Both of the deceased patients had actually contracted COVID-19, so there's a possibility, I guess, that they thought that throwing as much medication at it as possible might somehow be beneficial for them. Similar in spirit, if not in detail, to the process Joe Rogan described happened when he also contracted COVID-19. Neither version is a wise description of how medical dosing is actually meant to work. Now, I take this all on advisory. There was a previous story about a doctor saying the hospitals were overrun with ivermectin poisoning, which turned out to be false. But this isn't a random doctor, it's the State Department. And the American Association of Poison Control Centers has reported 1,400 cases of ivermectin poisoning for the year, so it is significantly more credible. And it just underlines the point. Self-medicating based on what you heard on YouTube or wherever else is a high-risk activity to be massively discouraged. I mean, seriously, Pierre Corey, who gets his videos taken down from YouTube for being across the line, he doesn't say you should be taking veterinary products. All right, what else has been going on? There's been an interesting kickback from a couple of prominent climate skeptics against the third-party climate fact-checking website. Quick recap. Regular viewers will know that I've mentioned several times the Climate Feedback website, which is supposed to provide fact-based scientific responses to high-profile articles making claims in the public domain, rating them as either true or different flavours of false or unsupported. Having initially thought this would be a great resource for my own research, and that's still true with caveats, I have had some doubts because of two things. One, some of the articles seem to mix actual fact-checking with a fair bit of opinion and argument, which wouldn't be a big problem if it wasn't positioned as a fact-checker. Because, two, it's one of the sources used by Facebook to downgrade articles posted onto it with notices calling them untrue. So it has some significant soft censorship power, not removing content, but officially labelling it as unreliable. Climate Feedback did that, for instance, to a piece by journalist John Stossel. Stossel worked at ABC News for more than 25 years before hosting a weekly news show on Fox Business. Now, he did a video on the 2020 wildfires in California. Climate Feedback rated that as misleading and missing context. As a result, Facebook slapped notices on postings of the video to say so. Stossel is now suing Facebook and Climate Feedback. He says that Climate Feedback falsely attributed a claim to him that he never made. Stossel says that his video said, while climate change undoubtedly contributes to forest fires, it was not the primary cause of the 2020 California fires. Now that's pretty much a good one-line description of what I remember about the video I did myself on the subject. I've watched the video that he made. It's well made, well argued. I agree with 80% of it, and the 20% is fair comment and up for debate. Stossel says that instead, Climate Feedback attributed the following argument to him. Forest fires are caused by poor management, not by climate change, which is the claim that got the fact check and therefore the Facebook intervention. Stossel's lawsuit argues that he was given no meaningful avenue to contest these unilateral decisions about the truth of his journalism. Meanwhile, his viewership plummeted due to both Facebook's censorship and the reputational harm caused by the false labels. Interestingly, Climate Feedback posted a response to the complaint, and I find it rather extraordinary. It goes like this. Stossel complains that we should not have rated his post using a claim review of a quote that does not appear in his video. This is a misunderstanding of how fact-checking partners operate on Facebook. Given that many pieces of content posted on Facebook can separately make the same claim, it is not necessary to create a separate claim review article for each post we rate. It is of course necessary that the claim we reviewed is representative of the claim in each post we rate, which is true in this case. So it's saying that lots of different posts can make basically the same claim. We shouldn't have to do a new specific rebuttal for every instance that may use trivially different wording. Surely you should respond to the exact content that you're highlighting. Otherwise, what the heck are you doing? They go on. Our review was based on one specific formulation of a claim we saw frequently appearing amidst record-setting wildfires on the US West Coast. Forest fires are caused by poor management, not by climate change. We relied on comments supplied by Free Scientists for a previous appearance of this exact claim by Michael Schellenberger, who was also the guest Stossel interviewed in his video. So the fact that Stossel had Schellenberger on his video seems to have been the thing that got his video slapped with the same rating they'd given before, even though the original Schellenberger quote was not modified or qualified in the way that Stossel's piece was. That seems to me to be sloppy on the part of a site that is making public judgments in this way. If you're rating a piece of content, you should rate it on what the content says, not what related people have also said that sounds kind of a bit like it. Stossel's rebuttal to their response concludes with this: some points in our video are debatable. We welcome a debate. We're open to the idea that hurricane intensity is rising and that CO2 hurts crops. People should keep an open mind about these issues. Unfortunately, Climate Feedback's response to our video shows that they are unwilling to debate. Sadly, they are now empowered to censor views they disagree with. Nobody's obliged to spend their time debating if they don't want to, but whether I agree with Stossel's positioning or not on a variety of issues is definitely a discussion that we should be having rather than censoring. Now, interestingly, a second front on the same battle was opened up by Bjorn Lomborg. Lomborg, whose positions I've critiqued here a number of times, has been making arguments about the fact that when people are talking about climate change, give the numbers about the people that will die from extreme heat events, they don't give the other side of the ledger, which is the people who won't die, who otherwise might have done, from extreme cold events. Now, in principle, that's a solid point. What are the negatives? What are the positives? How does it balance out? The answer to that question is only one aspect of all the various expected impacts of climate change, but it's still a pretty important one, and we want to get the full picture. Now, of course, Lomborg didn't quite stop there. Lomborg was writing in the New York Post, making the claim that while heat deaths were slowly rising, the risk from cold deaths were declining much faster, attributing this to the global burden of disease study. Specifically, global warming saves 166,000 lives each year. Once again, Climate Feedback has stepped in to set the record straight, and it rated the claim unsupported. Bjorn Lomborg's claim that 100k plus people are saved each year thanks to global warming is based on a misinterpretation of a study and interpretation of data that doesn't support such a conclusion. When I've reviewed Lomborg's sources for claims in the past, I have found that he often cherry picks or misrepresents studies, so let's see what they say. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, IHME, data cited by Lomborg on mortality and cold exposure show that rates of cold deaths have fallen, but those from heat have remained roughly the same between 1990 and 2019. However, neither these rates nor the cited papers in The Lancet are directly concerned with mortality risk from climate change. The issue with Lomborg's arguments is that he's using cherry-picked data that may be compelling in isolation, but belies a firm grasp of the science, which makes it clear that unmitigated climate change is a disaster for human health and welfare, even if we may, in the near term, see reductions in cold deaths. Now, that sounded sounding convincing and went rapidly off the rails. Obviously, cold deaths can fall for a number of reasons. Better insulation, more affordable heating, as well, of course, as climate changes. It's fair to say that if you're going to make a claim about the impact of climate change, whichever side that claim is supporting, you should be drawing from research that explicitly and convincingly makes the link. Now, that wouldn't necessarily stop Lomborg from saying that in the short term the effect could be beneficial and using those recent figures as evidence without making the claim that those figures are directly attributable to climate change. I would expect that the reality is we'd expect diminishing returns in the future for avoiding cold deaths and increasing rates for heat deaths. To be fair, whichever way is the direction of travel, that would be true. One would eventually reach zero and the other one would keep going. But I don't think the next part of the response belongs in a fact check. Unmitigated climate change is a disaster for human health and welfare, even if we may in the near term see reductions in cold deaths, because he was talking about the near term. I mean, it's a good argument, a rebuttal to Lomborg's case, although, he will say that he made no unlimited claims about the future. You can do all of that, but it's not the same as a fact check. It then goes on to make an ad hominem attack on Bjorn Lomborg, which also should not be in that sort of content, even if you believe it to be richly deserved. This is the essence of it. How far do we separate out arguments that we think to be wrong versus factual claims that are demonstrably not true? Climate feedback slips easily from one to the other, which would be fine if it wasn't being used as the basis for censorship. Lomborg responded to the piece and said that nowhere does it show that his 166,000 lives saved by climate change was wrong. I mean, I thought they kind of had by pointing out that the study he quoted didn't itself make the link to climate change. Again, with Lomborg, I'm left thinking that he's making a valid point, which is nevertheless based on slightly dodgy figures and an overbroad interpretation. It would be good if it prompted a more robust calculation on the same principle. No evidence right now that anyone's gearing up to provide it. If you've not seen any of my previous deep dive videos on the lab leak hypothesis, you might want to have a look at the first of those. It's quite a fascinating rabbit hole. Alternatively, if you're interested now to know more about Bjorn Lomborg's strongest arguments on climate change and to know what I think about those, that one might be an alternative to look at. See you on Friday for the news roundup.